The old mechanic wiped the sweat from his brow, smearing a streak of oil across his weathered face. He'd been working on a stubborn old truck all morning, hands steady despite the arthritis in his knuckles. The shop had been his second home for 30 years. He could recognize every creak of the concrete floor, every tool's weight in his palm. He didn't notice the hush that fell over the garage until the manager's voice barked his name. Asterisk, he straightened, frowning. The manager avoided his eyes, gesturing stiffly toward the cramped office. The mechanic felt something cold settle in his gut. Inside, the manager sat behind his desk like a judge behind a bench. Papers rustled. Words fell like hammers. "We're letting you go. It's just business costs. Nothing personal." Asterisk, the mechanic blinked. His mouth went dry. He opened it to protest, but nothing came out. Memories rushed at him. The years he trained green kids fresh out of school. The Christmases he covered other people's shifts, the loyalty he'd shown when the shop nearly went under. He tried to speak, voice cracking, but the manager's gaze stayed on the papers. Already moving on. Asterisk, he left the office in a fog. Coworkers watched, silent, avoiding his eyes. One younger guy he'd trained years ago muttered a quick, awkward, "Sorry, man," before turning away. The mechanic's hands shook as he opened his battered locker. A few old photos, a faded cap with the shop logo, his favorite wrench. He shoved them into a small cardboard box. Asterisk, no farewell party, no handshake. Just the echo of his boots on the concrete as he walked out into the harsh afternoon light. He stood in the parking lot squinting at the sun, the box feeling heavier than lead. He unlocked his rusty pickup, tossed the box onto the seat. As he sat behind the wheel, he took one last look at the shop. His shop then turned the key and drove off slowly, the engine rumbling like a last goodbye. Asterisk, the pickup rattled over potholes as he drove home. The afternoon sun casting long shadows that seemed to swallow him whole. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence pressed on his ears, louder than any music could have been. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the old house looked smaller, shabbier than ever. He sat there for a moment, staring at the front door, his fingers gripping the wheel until his knuckles went white. Asterisk, inside. The living room was dim, curtains drawn to keep the heat out. He dropped the cardboard box onto the sagging couch. The contents spilling slightly a photo of the shop crew from 20 years ago, that stupid old cap. He sank into the armchair with a groan, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like a countdown to something he couldn't escape. Asterisk, his spouse called softly from the kitchen, asking if he was okay. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was hoarse. "They let me go." There was silence, the kind that stings. Then the gentle clatter of a plate being set down. She came over and sat on the arm of the chair, resting a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. He didn't respond. Asterisk, his eyes wandered to the window. Through the grime on the glass, he could see the old shed out back, half swallowed by weeds. The door hanging crooked on its hinges. He remembered building that shed in better days, when he had energy to spare, when he believed hard work always paid off. Now it was just another thing falling apart. Asterisk, dinner went untouched. He shuffled through a pile of bills on the table, the numbers blurring. He ran a hand over his face, feeling every line, every year. His spouse tried to talk, to plan, but he barely heard her. Finally, she went to bed alone. He stayed up, nursing a cold cup of coffee, staring at the tools he'd rescued from his locker. Eventually, exhausted, he fell asleep right there at the table, schematics and crumpled papers spread before him like a battlefield. The weight of failure pressing heavy on his slumped shoulders. Asterisk, sunlight broke through thin gray clouds at dawn, painting the yard in pale gold. He stood at the back door, steaming coffee in hand, staring at the dilapidated shed. Dew glistened on the weeds choking its walls. He took a slow sip, exhaled, and set the cup down with a quiet finality. Today was the day he would stop feeling sorry for himself. Asterisk, he hauled open the crooked shed door with a rusty screech. Dust motes swirled in the slanted light. The place was a disaster: old tires, broken lawn tools, boxes of junk stacked to the roof. He took it in with a grimace, then grabbed the first box and heaved it out onto the grass. Asterisk, hours passed in a blur of sweat and curses. He pitched trash into a growing pile, wiped grime from salvaged tools, and tore down rotten shelves. His shirt clung to his back, streaked with dirt. By noon, he was on his knees, prying up warped floorboards to check the foundation. His joints ached with every move, but he kept going. Inside the house. His spouse watched through the window, worry and hope, battling on her face. She brought him water without a word, squeezing his shoulder before returning inside. He drank, greedily wiped his mouth on his sleeve and went back to work. Once cleared, he hung a single bulb from the ceiling and dragged in his battered workbench. Tools were cleaned, sorted, laid out with care. He spread yellowed blueprints across the table, tracing lines with calloused fingers. He frowned at the old design he'd once dreamed of, building a custom vehicle no one believed he could finish. He grabbed a pencil and began revising, lines crisscrossing in feverish inspiration. The work was slow. He scraped together money, 4 parts, scoured junkyards, called in old favors. Some days he felt young again, sparks flying from his welder as metal sang under his torch. Other days he sat on the stool, head bowed, clutching his sore hands. The sun was just cresting over the rooftops when he stood in front of the shed, breath misting in the cold morning air. His heart hammered in his chest, palms sweating despite the chill. He wiped them on his overalls and took a long, steadying breath. Today was the day. Months of work, no decades of experience, stubbornness and pride had led him here. He walked to the shed door, resting his hand on the worn wood. He remembered the first day he'd cleared it out, how hopeless it had seemed. Now, the hinges were oiled, the frame freshly painted. He turned, seeing people gathering at the end of his driveway, neighbors, old co-workers, kids on bikes. Word had spread. His spouse stood beside him, slipping a hand into his wheat. She squeezed gently. "Go on," she whispered. He nodded, swallowed hard, then stepped forward, with a flourish that surprised even him. He flung the door wide open. Light flooded in, catching polished chrome gleaming curves, every detail meticulously finished. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Inside sat his creation, a custom-built vehicle that looked both vintage and futuristic, with handcrafted panels, sleek lines, and clever engineering touches that he'd designed himself. The paint gleamed like liquid midnight, accented with crisp white pinstripes. Exposed engine parts shone like jewelry. He watched the crowd's eyes widen. Even the skeptics were silent, mouths hanging open. A little boy tugged his father's sleeve, whispering, "It's like something from a movie?" The mechanic walked around it proudly, explaining his design. He pointed to the modified engine he'd rebuilt with junkyard parts, the handmade leather seats, the smart electrical system he'd rigged from salvaged components. Every sentence was spoken with quiet authority earned through years of grease and grit. Reporters arrived, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. "How did you do it after they let you go?" someone asked. He paused, wiped a tear that threatened to fall, and looked at the vehicle with open affection. "I guess they forgot I didn't work for them," he said softly. "I worked for this." The crowd erupted in applause. Kids darted forward for a closer look, parents taking pictures. Even a former co-worker approached, eyes wide with reluctant respect. The old mechanic stood tall, shoulders back, pride glowing in every line of his face. He stood beside the car as the applause died down, his hands resting gently on the polished hood. The cameras pulled back, but the people stayed. Kids circled wide-eyed, pointing at the engine's gleaming pipes, whispering like they were in church. Even the neighbors who once scoffed now lingered, nodding to each other, some clapping him on the back. One older man, his former foreman, approached slowly, hat in hand. They locked eyes for a long moment, the years of bitterness crackling between them. The foreman cleared his throat. "Hell of a job," he mumbled, voice thick. "Didn't think you had it in you." The mechanic didn't gloat. He just nodded, eyes narrowing with quiet satisfaction. "Guess you were wrong." They shook hands, firm and real, the crowd watching in hushed respect. Later, he gave rides to laughing children, their parents snapping photos. He showed off the custom dashboard, the clever battery system, every detail he'd slaved over in the quiet hours when doubt had nearly won. His spouse sat beside him during one ride, beaming with unashamed pride. He caught her eye, and for a moment they were both young again, full of plans and energy. Before life had worn them down, local investor who'd seen the news coverage, he circled the car like a jeweler eyeing a flawless diamond. "You build more like this?" he asked tone, careful but intrigued. Asterisk the mechanic wiped his hands on his rag, heart thumping. Given the space and tools. Yeah, I can build more.